I was supposed to do this a couple of weeks ago, but I didn't make it that night. But this lesson came from, or this quick talk came from one of Ron's lessons when he was preaching or gave a lesson on purity. So it got me thinking and got me reading. And I know he mentioned Lot in that lesson. And I decided to kind of take it and run with it. But I want you to read that. How many escaped Sodom and Gomorrah? Just kind of put that in the back of your head. And we're going to do a quick review of that and make some points and maybe make you think a little bit this evening, which is the point. In Genesis 18:23 and 24, it says, and Abraham came near and said, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous? So Abraham is petitioning or interceding for Sodom at this point. And in Genesis 18:32, it says, then he said, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak but once more. Suppose 10 should be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So we've gone from 50 down to 10. He is, I guess, bartered, you might say. That might be a word you could use. Pled, however you want to put it. And in Genesis 19:12 and 13, then the men said to Lot, referring to the men are the angels. Angels came and visited Lot. Have you anyone else here, son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whoever you have in the city? Take them out of this place, for we will destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So obviously we find out that 10 righteous could not be found, right? Because God's not going to he's not going to break his promise. You know, that was the deal. You find 10, I'm going to spare the city. 10 were not to be found. And you know, I think probably God knew this to begin with, right? I think that may have been the point. Then in Genesis 19:14, it says, and Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who had married his daughters and said, get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But to his sons-in-law, he seemed to be joking to some extent, or a lot of extent. The influence of the city had taken. You know, they weren't, you know, I'm guessing they were slipping. I would think at some point in time they were righteous, you know, and were under the influence of Lot. But at this point in time, they thought, no, I'm not leaving the city. And you know, I think you're joking, you know. And the idea that you can be around sinful people and sinful practices and not be affected is a great lie, you know. And a lot of people tell themselves that lie, that they can live amongst it and not be affected, when it is a lie. Because I don't care how strong a Christian you are, that's going to creep in. It's going to creep in. You know, we as Christians don't need to be putting ourselves in situations that is going to damage our eternity. Plain and simple. If you're around people doing sinful things, you're jeopardizing your salvation. You are taking a chance. You know, and you kind of liken this to, you know, people found out, you know, nutrition is a big thing now, and it's the same theory. You know, people have figured out that, you know, if you eat a bunch of processed food, and then you go out and try to, you know, run a race or exercise or you know, do whatever you want to do, work hard, dig a ditch, whatever, you know, your body doesn't have the right fuel. You can't do it. You're not going to be successful. So you got to put good food, good things in your body to get the effect that you want, to get the performance that you want. And it's the same thing with your brain. You know, if you feed your brain with that, you know, evil, with those sins, it's not going to perform well. It's going to go in a direction you don't want it to go. You know, you're going to be involved in things that you shouldn't be involved in, and those things can be harmful to you. Um, if you feed your brain sin, you will eventually be part of that sin, or part of a sin that you shouldn't be, you know, a party to. And the same thing, it works just the opposite way. If you read God's word, if you feed your brain with righteousness, you're going to get closer to salvation. You're going to get closer to what God has planned for you. And that idea, it was true then and it is true today. So we know the Bible, there's no new sin, there's no new things. They dealt with it then, and we're dealing with it today. Today we just have a lot more access to it, I think. Then Genesis 19:15 through 16, it says, when the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. And while he lingered, and that is my underlining in bold, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. I always think we can learn from the scriptures the more we read it. When I read through this again, I'm like, Lot and his family were to some extent forcibly removed from the city. Right? I think he was going to leave. I think that was the plan. I think that was his plan. But we see there, he lingered. And the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hands, and the hands of his 2 daughters, and let him out. Took him out. Here, quit lingering. Let's go. Because it reads, and while he lingered. So to some extent, I'm going to say Lot was affected. He was affected by the city, not as much as his son-in-laws. His son-in-laws thought it was a joke and wasn't leaving. At least Lot believed it. He believed that he needed to get out of the city. But I'm going to tell you, lingering should not have been his reaction. If say, for instance, a reputable source came to you and said, you know what, I have found a bomb in your home and it has a timer on it and it's going to go off in an hour, would you linger? Would you linger? Would you go, I love this house and I really love the things, and what, I'm going to enjoy one more showing from the television. Is that what you would do? And we knew it was a reputable source, right? In Genesis 19:1, it says, now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. He immediately knew they were angels. You have to conclude that's a reputable source, right? You have to believe, Lot knew who he was talking to. And like I say, in the verse later, Lot was troubled by the evil goings on in the city. There's no doubt about it. He was troubled about it. But it was a reputable source. Get out of the city, yet he lingered. And he was also given some instruction in Genesis 19:17. It says, escape for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed. So we have a couple of instructions here. Go to the mountains, don't stay in the plain, and do not look behind you. And we know Lot's wife was still holding on to something in Sodom, some influence, or some wanting, some yearning, some missing, and she was immediately turned to a pillar of salt. In Genesis 19:26, it says, but his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. She was holding on to something. Of course, Lot did petition here to live in the small city of Zoar, and it was allowed, but that was not the initial instruction. Get out, go to the mountains. That was the initial instruction. However, a little, doesn't really say how long, he did decide to move into the mountains, which was the initial instruction that he was given. So Lot and his 2 daughters lived in a cave, and then his daughters, let in an evil thought. Something crept into their hearts, thinking that they were going to, we're going to prolong Lot's line. There's no men here. and he needs a son. We need to keep this going on. So they had this idea, you know, and they acted on it. And in James 1:14 through 15, it kind of explains how that happens. It says, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. They decided they're gonna, they're gonna help God out, I'm guessing, and we're gonna prolong this lineage, Lot's lineage. This is our idea, or what we're gonna do here, and they acted on it. And you kind of think of the same situation, or a similar situation, when Abraham said that Sarah was a sister. This is a lie I'm going to tell. I'm going to tell this lie. Or Uzzah, they're transporting the ark on that cart, and Uzzah's like, well, this is a good deed. I'm going to keep that ark from tipping over. I'm going to help God out here. Even though He commanded this, I'm going to do this. And we see those two examples. In Genesis 19:34 through and 35, it says, it happened on the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, indeed, I lay with my father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our fathers. Then they made their father drunk with wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. So both daughters ended up lying with Lot. And then in Genesis 19:36, it says, thus both of the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. And those children were the Moabites, the Ammonites, which in many cases through the Old Testament, they warred with Israel. Although we do have the example of Ruth coming out of that lineage. But for the most part, they were warring with Israel. And 1 Corinthians tells us, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. And we can see that in these situations. We can see it with Lot's wife, who turned back. We can see it with his daughters, who maybe were exposed to some of that within the city. Regardless, you are going to be influenced by the company you keep, whether that be good or whether it be bad. And it boils down to, what is your choice? What is the company that you choose to keep? Do you choose to hang with the sinners? Or do you choose to be with the righteous and work on your salvation? And like I say, bottom line, it is your choice. In 2 Peter 2:7-8, this is God, and delivered righteous Lot, who is oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked, for that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. A lot of people think about Lot and how he made those choices, and how can he still be righteous? He chose to keep his family in that city, knowing that those influences were going to affect him. He chose to do that, but I'm going to tell you, he wasn't perfect, and none of us are. But I'm going to tell you, the fact that he is called righteous here, it tells us that God knew his heart. God knew his heart, and that he believed in God, and that he believed in God's plan. That's how he stayed righteous. And that's how we have to stay righteous today. We can't live sin-free lives. We can try, and we do try, but it does creep in. It does creep in sometimes. And we need to realize it and be aware of it and put it out of our heads. So the question is, how many escaped Sodom and Gomorrah? 4 got out of the city, right? Lot's wife was out of the city when she looked back, which leaves 3. 3 made it to the mountains. But then we know what his daughters did. Physically, they made it out. Physically, they did. But then we have righteous Lot, who also wasn't a perfect man. He wasn't a perfect man. God called him righteous, but he made some mistakes that maybe could have been avoided. So the fact that they escaped was great. But did they carry a little bit of Sodom with them? Not literal Sodom, for what was going on in Sodom. And I'll ask you tonight, do you carry around a little bit of Sodom in you? You know, do you carry around some kind of pet sin or some kind of evil thing in you that you're not willing to give up? Because I'm going to tell you, it's going to affect you at some point. It's going to affect your family at some point. It's going to affect your loved ones. It's going to affect other people at some point. So get rid of that little bit of Sodom that's in your heart. Get rid of it. Think about your company and the results of the company that you keep. I appreciate you listening. Thought there was an interesting take on Sodom and Gomorrah and thinking about those aspects of it, because you always learn something from the scriptures every time you study them. If there is someone here tonight that is in need of the invitation, we ask that you don't hesitate to come forward as we stand and sing the song. There